Now I just realized I can't see my notes, but all right, we'll get started here in a second, everyone. I'll give everyone a chance to get logged in. I actually might have to stop sharing the presentation to see my notes. I apologize, everybody. Okay, all right, we're gonna go ahead and get started. Good morning, everyone. Let's see, we have participants joining now. So good morning and welcome to the September webinar hosted by the St. Louis Metro section of the Missouri chapter of the American Planning Association. We're happy to have you all here to join us today. My name is Jonathan Raish. I work for the city of Kirkwood, Missouri, and I'm a member of the section's Diversity and Inclusion Committee. We're hosting the webinar today. I'll be acting as the behind the scenes host for today's webinar. But before we begin, we have a few items to go over. First, the webinar is being recorded and will be posted to the section's YouTube channel. So you can just look that up on YouTube and find this or refer people to it later. Next, the webinar series. So this is November's event, but we'll take a hiatus in October because of the great programming that's part of the Missouri State Chapter conference that's scheduled for October 5th through 7th. So I also wanted to call attention to that. That conference is being held at Live by Lowe's in downtown St. Louis. If you have not had a chance to check that out or register, please do so. You can go to the chapter website at missouri.planning.org. And there's information, including a full schedule of programs, the full program there. The registration deadline to get a hotel room in the reserve block was extended until 5 p.m. today. So if you haven't and need to, do that by 5 p.m. today. And registration for the conference itself, the deadline is September 28th. So please join us here downtown St. Louis for the state conference for some great programming, including mobile workshops and a lot of exciting things. So another program that we have going on for the St. Louis Metro section right now is our annual section awards. So for those of you in our section doing great planning work within the section, we have nominations for those awards that are due by 5 p.m. this Friday on September 23rd. The categories are outstanding plan making, outstanding best planning practice, and outstanding planning advocate. So we'd love to see the work that you're all doing and get a chance to recognize that work as well. This webinar series will be back in November, so you can check in again on our website for additional information. And if you aren't already, sign up to receive our email newsletters as more details come out. So for today's session, on the housekeeping side, we'll have an opportunity for question and answer at the end of the presentation. Please use the Q&A function of Zoom for that. Try to focus them there. We'll use the chat if there are technical issues or other just comments people want to make, but please, for question and answer, use the Q&A function of Zoom. And yeah, please submit those. Feel free to submit those throughout the presentation so we can help kind of organize as we go along, and then we'll go through them at the end. Let's see. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to the chair of our Diversity and Inclusion Committee of the Metro section, Shilpi Bharti, who will introduce today's topic.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining the APA St. Louis Metro Section September Luncheon. Today's Luncheon is a presentation on equity in transportation planning to be presented by a diverse group of planners working across the St. Louis region to deliver equitable transportation solutions for all. Attendees joining today's presentation will qualify for one Equity CM credit. And as Jonathan mentioned, question answers will be followed at the end of the session. I would like to welcome Ms. Katie Shackelford from Stantec, who is moderator for today's presentation. Ms. Katie is an innovative, accredited urban planning professional and funding specialist with 10 years of experience. She specializes in transportation planning, economic development, and policy and public policy, and has a talent for creating catalytic community impacts using infrastructure investment. With that brief introduction, I would like Katie to take over today's session.
Thanks for that, and thank you all for being here today. We're really excited to have this session for you today, this transportation and equity. We were invited to do this section in response to a similar session that Betsy and I participated in earlier this year for APA Illinois. It was so well received. We were asked to do it again, and we are excited to be here to share with you some updates and some more information about equity related to the St. Louis area. But first, let's kick it off with just a brief intro to equity. Next slide. All right. Equity is a 6-letter word packing a great deal of social implications. Now, equity is often confused with equality, but the difference is equality promotes fairness by giving everybody the same thing, whereas equity revolves around giving everybody what they need. Equality works only when everyone is starting at the same place and needs the same thing. In the world we live in, not many people are starting at the same place or need the same thing. This is what makes equity such an important topic for planning professionals today. Municipalities are tasked with allocating very scarce and valuable resources on their infrastructure improvements that directly impact their citizens and economic opportunities. Opportunities such as education, employment, healthcare, and many other factors that contribute to a person's overall prosperity and quality of life. So that is why we're taking a deep dive into transportation and equity. Next slide. As many of you are aware, AICP is evolving and taking a greater focus on creating greater equity, diversity, and inclusion in all aspects of the certification program. The American Planning Association recognizes that professional certification shares a history of gatekeeping and exclusion, and that it is our duty to mitigate the discrimination impacts of our own history by making structural substantive changes which are now underway. The APA will strive to build a more diverse group of AICP certified planners who, in their diversity, reflect the lived experiences and perspectives of the communities they serve. As the leaders of the profession, certified planners must also be equipped with the knowledge and practices and be supported and inspired by AICP's ethical principles to improve social equity and address the challenges communities are facing today. Planners have a special responsibility to serve the public interest, expand choice and opportunity for all persons, and to plan for the needs of the disadvantaged, as asserted in the AICP Code of Ethics and Professional Conduct. Beginning in January of this year, equity was added as a mandatory credit requirement for AICP, and in an effort to provide more opportunities for planners to expand their equity education, programs like this are being provided. So we hope that you take heed of this information. Let us know if you have questions. Obviously, this is an evolving program, but we do want to get your feedback. On the next slide, you will see our panelists. So today we're going to be hearing from a number of professionals and practitioners who are working to implement equitable transportation solutions in the St. Louis Metro. I'll let them introduce themselves. Our first representative is Betsy Tracy from Federal Highway.
Hello, I am in the Illinois division of FHWA as a transportation planner. I've been there about 12 years, and part of that was with the state of Illinois for a long time, including the Illinois Department of Transportation. So I'm very glad to be here. Thank you.
Thank you for coming, Betsy. Saranya from East West Gateway.
Hi, everyone. So I am the Long Range and Corridor Planning Coordinator here at East West Gateway. I'm pretty new to the organization, started this year, but I was previously in the San Francisco area where I worked in local government and also worked on autonomous vehicle technology. Here at East West Gateway, my main role is to really drive the development of the long-range transportation plan for the St. Louis region.
Thanks for joining us today, Saranya. And then finally, Chris Peoples will be joining us from Great Rivers Greenway.
Yeah, how you guys doing? My name's Chris Peoples with Great Rivers Greenway. I'm the Equity and Economic Impact Director for Great Rivers Greenway. I'm the first person in my position. Been in my role for 6 weeks when they hired me. Prior to being in this role, I was at Great Rivers Greenway as a senior project manager, overseeing the Hodemont and Brickline projects. Prior to coming to GRG, I was the owner and operator of Pittsman Company, a local land surveying and civil engineering company. Therefore, my background is a civil engineer and a land surveyor. So excited to be with you guys today.
And with that, we're going to go ahead and turn it over to Betsy, who's going to introduce us to equity transportation from the federal standpoint.
Thank you very much, Katie. Essentially, as you know, since the new transportation bill was signed into law, there's a tremendous focus on equity. And what I'm going to do today is just briefly talk about some of the resources that are available and how it kind of impacts federal funding. So next slide. So the first kind of thing out of the chute, more or less, was an executive order on advancing racial equity and support for underserved communities through the federal government. And we're going to see this theme over and over again in many, especially in the discretionary programs that some of you may be working on applications for. And in this presentation, hopefully you have all received it or will receive it. I believe all these are live links. So when you have some time, please, take a look at this. But it does talk about the importance of investing in communities and including, making sure that, there is, racial equity and support. And so I see that as kind of, kicking off, things that are, we're now seeing programs, and most of the applications will, have an element that, does, you have to address. And I think, that this is certainly heading in a good direction, but this is kind of the precursor, whatever, kind of what the rest of it is that we're going to talk about, or I'm going to talk about. So the U.S. Department of Transportation puts out a strategic plan, this one that was just released for FY22 to FY26, includes several tenets or goals. And as you can see on the schematic here, safety, economic strength, and global competitiveness, equity, climate and sustainability, transformation, and organizational excellence. So you can see it's kind of risen to the level of being one of the handful of priorities or goals for the organization. And this is not just Federal Highway Administration. This is all units of US DOT. So again, that's a live link. Moving forward. Next slide. Then there was additionally, there is an equity action plan, which talks about kind of how we're going to, implement a lot of this. And there was actually really, I don't know if any of you had an opportunity to attend the webinar on May 25th, but there was a session on equity where a lot of the top level folks of US DOT spoke about the plan and kind of what the activities would be moving forward. And so that is available. I think it's about an hour in length. And if you have a time, I think it'd be really good to view that. And it really talks about kind of how it's a living document and how they're going to implement it. So that was another major piece of this, administration and the rollout of their priorities. Next slide. And of course, we've already talked a little bit about what equity is, and there's a link here again, learning more about, Secretary Buttigieg's, comments here on what, some of this means and how it is a strategic goal for the entire department. So next slide. Again, this equity event, this session that I mentioned, that registration, I think it's now an archive link, so you can see that. And then these are all very good resources to kind of keep up with things. Things are moving very quickly right now, and just trying to keep, if you want to kind of keep up with things, this is a good thing to do, to bookmark, where a lot of this is kind of heading very quickly. So, and again, another live link. And you can sign up for email if you want to keep on a mailing list, which, in your work, you may want to do this and submit that your email address. I don't think we've heard anything. I haven't seen anything in writing on this yet, but there was a survey of MPOs and DOTs, and this is kind of where some of you might be interested as well, regarding their current practices incorporating equity and meaningful public involvement in transportation planning and project decision-making. And those comments were due in mid-May of 22. And I don't think we've seen necessarily the outcome of that yet, but I don't know if they actually, I think they had to put it in the Federal Register in order to ensure that they could, you know, under the Paperwork Reduction Act or something, that they could take this survey. So we will be looking for finding out what all the states DOTs are doing and all the MPOs. So if you work for an MPO, if you haven't seen this, you'll probably see it before too long. Or if you work for a DOT, you may see this, and I take it as they're kind of getting a baseline of what's going on. And a lot of times we do see this as kind of a precursor to guideline guidance, or, you know, regs or something. Yeah, you know, so you know, we've seen this kind of in other areas, and there's nothing that says there is a requirement. I mean, you know, that you have to fill it out or that you have to do certain things, but I think, you know, this is definitely going to get a baseline, and I'm sure it will get a lot of public you know, distribution. And so please do respond to that if it comes into your organization. Next slide. So this is kind of the latest piece that I think is really helpful as you're doing some planning or studies, and that would be especially in light of the discretionary programs that all have a component for equity. I believe all of them do. I may be misstating that, but I think they all do. So essentially, and I think I heard Saranya just speak the other day very artfully, and I'm sure she'll tell you what East West Gateway is doing, but I think that there are a lot of tools that are going to be available in the public domain here that you'll be able to use that will help you to do some screening. And so there are some distinct things. Again, there should be, I think, a live link, but there's transportation, disadvantaged census tracts, areas of persistent poverty, historic, it's blocking my, yeah, the 4 items are here: the EJ screen, the social vulnerability index, and all those tools are, you know, they are available currently and available to, you know, for all of us to use. So you can definitely suggest getting out there. If you could do one thing after today's presentation in my section, you know, please take a look at those tools, because I think they'll be very helpful as you apply for federal funding.
And Betsy, just as if we move ahead, I
Oh,
just
yes,
wanted
I'm
to
sorry
say,
that you do have them there.
we've shown some examples, and the biggest takeaway for those of you that are working to identify your disadvantaged communities is to recognize that not all the resources show the same information. So what you see on your screen is USDOT's Disadvantaged Communities web app. It uses 22 indicators that cultivate 6 categories. If you move to the next slide, you'll see a different agency. So each agency is creating their own tool for measuring equity and equity impacts. So recognize that what, for instance, the EPA might say and the USDOT might say are not exactly the same thing. So this is then the CDC's Social Vulnerability Index. All of these are tools to help you identify where there is vulnerability in your community.
Yeah, but it's a nice visual, you know, view, very, you know, kind of easy to manipulate, I think. And the other thing is, you know, you might overlay these things depending upon what your, you know, what kind of project you're working on, you know, that is going to help to get you to the point where you can, you know, make your case and to show these things. But yeah, excellent point that they are showing, you know, they're different, they're populated by different agencies for maybe different purposes. But I think as you kind of layer it, you see there's a lot of overlap, and I mean, which makes sense. So, but thank you. And then I think our next slide. This is another kind of new initiative, and I'm going to be honest with you, in our agency, they're just like every other day, there's something coming out about a new program or new offerings. And this is actually a new program that they're obtaining information. I think it's still, let's see, I think the comment period, I think if it's over, you know, they're probably assembling comments, whatever. However, this particular one is providing not funding, but this is technical support. So this is yet a different kind of type of program that monies will be available for. So again, it should be a live link, and, you know, kind of stay tuned on all these. But this is kind of new since we talked last. And then the DOT Navigator is a new resource to help communicate help communities understand the best ways to apply for grants and to plan and deliver transformative infrastructure projects and services. And again, you can use this yet another kind of tool that you could use. But right now it's I've heard it say it's kind of once in a generation, or it's just tremendous amount of funding coming from the federal government to do all sorts of things. And hopefully you can find in your areas some eligible projects that or studies that will help your communities. And this we haven't seen kind of the outcome of some of these programs yet, so we don't know kind of the success stories quite yet. And hopefully we'll be able to share those in the future. But right now it's just very much a kind of a canvas that that's out there that you need to kind of I think position yourself in such a way so that you're knowledgeable, so what your clients are can apply for, because this is pretty historic time. So I think that's the last slide. So thank you so much for your time.
All right, thank you. So I'm going to start with a little bit of an overview just on East West Gateway and who we are, make sure everybody in the room is oriented to what we do. So East West Gateway is the regional metropolitan planning organization for St. Louis. We represent 8 counties across the states of Missouri and Illinois. And we're also governed by a 29-member board of directors. As an agency, we have many teams and priorities, but a key federally mandated role is to maintain a long-range transportation plan to define regional transportation priorities over a 20-year horizon. The long-range transportation plan allocates limited financial resources to transportation projects. We are currently in the process of developing the Connected 2050 LRTP to be published in June 2023. Another critical document that we publish is the Transportation Improvement Program, or TIP, which is the short-term implementation of the long-range plan. Generally looks at the next 4 to 5 years of projects that are scheduled to be implemented. Next slide. Because we play such a critical role in allocating federal transportation funds, we need to always be cognizant of how our agency decisions and actions lead us towards or away from equitable transportation outcomes. At East West Gateway, we define equity as ensuring the transportation system is working for everyone in the region and all voices are heard, including populations that are traditionally underserved. So there are several areas in which we think about equity throughout the agency, and I've just highlighted 3 on this slide. This is not comprehensive, but the first area is through our Title VI compliance efforts. We maintain a Title VI program that focuses on how East West Gateway will comply with the non-discrimination requirements found in Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And also executive orders that address environmental justice and persons with limited English proficiency. The second area to highlight is our public involvement plan, which outlines the expectations and procedures for public involvement in the St. Louis region. Our top objective in this plan is to ensure meaningful participation opportunities for all communities. And so for every project, we lay out a community engagement strategy ahead of time to make sure we're engaging all the communities. And then finally, another area in which we consider equity is through our project selection process for both the long-range transportation plan and the TIP. So the map to the right shows high concentrations of environmental justice populations by census tract. The population groups that we include in here include minorities, low-income individuals, disabled populations, the elderly, and zero vehicle households. And one criteria that we look at when evaluating projects is whether the project provides benefits to or increases burdens on these environmental justice populations. This is something that we're looking at for really every project and evaluating it against this chart here, this map here. Okay, so let's zoom out from East-West Gateway's processes and look at a few examples of equity challenges across the region. The first map here shows concentrations of bicycle and pedestrian crash fatalities over a 5-year period. And this is overlaid with a map of low income and minority environmental justice communities. If you can hit the next button on the slides, we'll get a zoom in since it's hard to see. And so here you can see the concentrations and the overlay is in the dots that you see. And when we first went out to create this map, we didn't expect the correlation in those two areas to be as strong as it was. But it's clear that our low-income and minority populations are facing an unfair burden when it comes to safety while walking and biking within the region. Next slide. All right, this is another example. This shows two maps that show job accessibility by mode. Each map shows the percentage of jobs that can be reached within a 45-minute travel time. On the left, you see accessibility by automobile, and then on the right, you see accessibility by transit. And there's obviously a stark difference between the two. One of our environmental justice communities of interest is no vehicle households. And you can see how access is limited if you don't have a car. And just as a side note, if you take a look at the legend and the scales used on these two maps, they're actually different. So on the automobiles, we go from 1% to 100%. And on transit, we go from 0.01 to 23.8%. So the difference in the two is in even greater contrast than you're seeing on these maps here. Okay, so I've gone over some of the internal practices at East-West Gateway and presented just a few charts here on regional data. And I think the question then becomes, how are we actually doing with respect to equity and transportation? And if you ask, have we achieved equitable outcomes in transportation? The answer is clearly no. And you can tell that just by looking at these maps. But if you're asked if we're trending in the right direction and are making good decisions in how we allocate federal funds, that answer is less clear. Next slide. All right. So to try and get a better answer to some of these tough questions, East-West Gateway is currently working on an equity investment analysis report. I'm going to refer to that as the EIA going forward. This report is part of the Connected 2050 Long Range Plan development, and the EIA contains a current conditions analysis, and I presented a few of the maps from the analysis in the last two slides. And the EIA also contains an analysis of past transportation investments from a qualitative and quantitative perspective. The goal ultimately here is to develop a list of recommendations on how we can more strongly incorporate equity considerations throughout the transportation planning process. A question that we're often asked is, why conduct an equity analysis? The main reason is that it's the right thing to do and that all people in the region deserve a transportation system that meets their needs. But other important areas are, we want to recognize the role that past transportation decisions have had in shaping the St. Louis region. We want to support compliance with federal requirements that prohibit discrimination. We want to help the St. Louis region compete for new funding. As Betsy talked about, a lot of these new discretionary programs have a large equity component with them. And we want to be competitive against a lot of the other regions to get funding to our communities. We also want to contribute to general stakeholder efforts to address disparities in the region. That's ultimately what we're looking at when we are looking at equity, is addressing those disparities. And finally, we want to provide benefits to the entire region. We know that addressing equity really lifts the region as a whole, and we believe that going through this equity analysis and providing recommendations can help us to do that. Okay, so the next few slides are just some excerpts from our report. The report is in progress. We're working on it. It's not done yet. So I'm just kind of pulling out some excerpts and some interesting findings. The first chapter of our EIA is a qualitative historical analysis, which looks back to the early 20th century, and in particular, the period following the Great Depression and World War II. So during this time, there were large federal investments in developing the interstate highway system, which had a lot of benefits for some, but also harmed many communities by displacing and dividing those communities. And those communities were largely African-American. Highways and urban renewal policies worked together with the intent to repurpose areas, resulting in the demolition of largely African-American homes. And on the right, you can see an image showing conditions today in a small section of St. Louis, overlaid in lines of yellow of properties from 1950. This is the Mill Creek Valley neighborhood, and it's overlaid. You can see Chaffetz Arena there and Interstate 64. This basically shows that there was a full-scale destruction of the Mill Creek Valley neighborhood, and you can see right at the bottom how a highway tore right through that neighborhood and divided it. Also at the bottom of the slide, you can see that an article from the St. Louis Post-Dispatch that showed the propaganda that was used at the time to gain public support for these urban renewal efforts. Thousands of families and businesses were displaced as a result of a lot of these federal policies. And it's also important to note that in addition to the transportation and urban renewal policies, federal housing policies also reinforce the segregation and left communities out of wealth creation. I think a critical takeaway here is that the impacts of these past transportation and housing policies have had lasting impacts on the St. Louis region. These policies led to large-scale suburbanization and a departure from the city, with a lot of new developments only accessible by automobile. The transit network in St. Louis also saw a lot of disinvestment as the dense streetcar network that we had was pulled out and replaced by bus service. And a lot of the new suburban areas didn't have the density of the street network to support transit. And this left disproportionately Black and lower income communities in the city in persistent poverty with limited connections to economic opportunities, which were only accessible by the automobile. Next slide. So on the last slide, I focused in on the time period roughly between the 1940s and 60s. But in our historical analysis, we are working on, in the report, we talk about a time span much larger than that. This is a timeline starting from the 1840s to now. And I know it's hard to read, but it lists key events, including transportation developments in the St. Louis region, regional demographic shifts, and federal policies. And the narrative and the qualitative historical analysis ties all of these together and draws connections between these events and discusses the impacts that they had on a region. Okay, next slide. So one of the challenges when we go back a long distance in time is it's hard to get the numbers. But if we look back more recently, we can actually do a quantitative analysis of investments. So a part of our EIA is looking at our TIP projects over the past 10 to 15 years. And the map to the left shows the location of pedestrian projects in our TIP since the early 1990s. We have a higher concentration of projects within the I-270 ring, which makes sense because we have higher population densities in those areas. But this is just an example of the type of analysis that we're doing, looking at past transportation investments by project type. But we'll also be looking at investments by location at the county and municipality level. Ultimately, through this effort, we want to develop a framework for not just analyzing past investments, but to evaluate future investments as well. So for this section, it's definitely stay tuned to hear our insights. Right, next slide. All right, so as I indicated earlier, we're in the middle of this process and we are currently brainstorming recommendations. We want to see, there are a couple of areas which we are kind of grouping our recommendations. The first area is we want to see how we can better support under-resourced communities in the region in accessing federal dollars. We've found through our research that many communities don't necessarily have transportation planning staff, and as a result may not even submit applications to try to get federal money into their communities. Another challenge that low-income communities have is the ability to put up a local match. Most federal funding programs require a 20% match, not all of them, 20% local match. And so that can often be challenging for under-resourced communities. Another focus area in our recommendations is to look inwards at the East-West Gateway process and really look at how we select our projects and try to come up with a better methodology for how we select projects so that it's more equitable. And finally, we also want to make sure that we align federal goals and policies with our regional needs and that we communicate successes and challenges that we encounter throughout the region in improving equity. So overall, that's the summary of my presentation. I just want to give a heads up to everyone on the call that lives or works in the St. Louis region. Work on this is EIA is continuing. We're actually going to have a virtual open house specifically focused on equity and transportation. That's going to be opening October 2022. And then the draft Connected 2050 plan with the EIA is going to be released March 2023, and the final will be published in June 2023. And there's a link to our website where you can find all of this information. All right, that's it for me.
Thank you. And I think that's a great transition. Looking at the two previous speakers, they tie directly into this project. As a public-private partnership, this project has received funding from both East-West Gateway and the US DOT. So I think this is a great transition. Next slide. So what I want to dive into first is what is Great Rivers Greenway as an organization. So Great Rivers Greenway is a public agency that was created in 2000 by the vote of the people of St. Louis City, St. Louis County, and St. Charles County. We are funded by sales tax dollars dedicated solely to the use of parks and greenways. The numbers are missing, so you have to trust me on this, but the impact by numbers are we have 16 established greenway systems. We have over 250 partners ranging from municipalities to institutions to public service agencies. With over 3 million visitors a year, we rank as one of the region's top attractions next to the St. Louis Zoo and the Cardinals. Our overall mission is to make St. Louis region a more vibrant place to live, to work, to play, and to develop a regional network of greenways. It should be noted that 94 cents of every dollar we receive goes towards the planning, construction, and maintenance of the network of greenways. Next slide. So how did the Brick Line Greenway come about? Early concepts of the Brick Line Greenway, formerly known as the Shoto Greenway, preceded GRG. The vision was by a number of regional stakeholders a concept of the Shoto Greenway to connect Forest Park to downtown St. Louis, particularly the Arch Grounds. In late 2017, early 2018, GRG selected 4 design teams to launch a project through community engagement and a design competition. Out of these efforts, this overall framework was created, expanding the initial mission of connecting the city not just east to west, but also north to south. Next slide. This framework plan looked at establishing a more exclusive and equitable community by connecting the city's 4 major parks. In spring of 2020, the GRG board, after receiving input from the community, decided to select a new name as Brickline Greenway to reflect the new plan of the proposed Greenway system, which would weave our region back together. This slide here shows the initial backbone and the skeleton from the Brickline Greenway. Next slide. So as we looked at this project, we knew we didn't have all the answers, just a lot of questions. We recognized through this engagement that this project must be led and driven by engagement. Through this engagement, we knew that we needed to address 3 key concerns: how to plan, build, and bring along a life of a greenway that has diversity, inclusion, and equity as its cornerstones, how to support economic development at multiple levels and in an equitable way, and how to create a sustainable infrastructure project that can be taking care of the community over time. Next slide. Next slide. Sorry. We developed the engagement process that was unique to this project, but we now use that on other projects. The strategy was meant to ensure equitable involvement throughout the process and making sure that all voices would be heard. We understood that it was to properly inform and conduct the planning and design for this greenway. It had to be tailored to the audience, to each neighborhood, and to each community. This diagram, the axe, the line, and act, is meant to describe the ongoing interactive process that continues throughout the planning, design, and development of this project. And it incorporates the community impact and feedback along the way. Next slide. So far, civil engagement and public participation has been included in a wide range of involvement activities. We have engaged with elected officials on the local, state, and federal level. We have involved community leaders, residents, and stakeholders. We always are looking for new opportunities to bring this overall group of people together to facilitate a conversation across all of our stakeholders and make sure that we're seeking a common ground. Next slide. Early on in our engagement, we recognized that a working group solely focused on equity and economic impact of this project was needed for something of this magnitude. Next slide. This working group was formed by some of the region's best DEI and community development professionals who examined similar projects throughout the country. As you can see, some of the great projects throughout the country. You have the Atlanta Beltline in Atlanta. You have the High Line in New York. You have the Cultural Trail in Indianapolis. Looking at some of these similar projects, they looked at lessons learned from them. They examined the good, the bad, and the ugly. An example is the Atlanta Beltline, which helped stabilize the adjacent neighborhoods, but it also increased property values and a displacement rate at an exponential rate. Next slide. But the evidence is there. For millions invested in these projects, hundreds of millions to billions of economic growth is returned to these communities. Next slide. It is known that public infrastructure projects can be a catalyst for growth. Studies show that there is an increase in economic development and growth within a quarter of a mile of any Greenway project. What we've looked at GRG is trying to expand that footprint and understanding that working not only just adjacent to the Greenway, but also expanding that not just a quarter of a mile out, but also taking it further and understanding the impact to the overall communities adjacent to the Greenway, understanding that we're operating in a more urban setting. Next slide. This growth can be stimulated by new facilities, next slide, new business opportunities, next slide, and new development overall, this being commercial and residential. And it should be noted that all of this takes place within a 5-minute walk of the new Greenway. Next slide. The expected economic impact of the Brick Line Greenway is known. This project is cited by both the 2030 jobs plan and the city roadmap to economic justice as a driver for job creation and population growth. It is widely supported throughout the region and was promoted early by some of these key partners. Greater St. Louis Inc., SLDC, and then private partnerships like US Bank, Midwest Bank Center, and institutions like WashU and St. Louis University. Next slide. But let's circle back to those original 3 questions that I stated before and see how equity must be addressed in those. How do we plan, build, and bring to life a greenway that is diverse, inclusive, and equitable? How do we support economic development at a level that's equitable for all? And how do we create a sustainable infrastructure project that can be taken care of by the community? And by being taken care of by the community, that is us helping create partnerships throughout the project area. The Equity and Economic Development Working Group generated some clear-cut recommendations that would be attainable and also have defined metrics that we could track our progress. Next slide. So those goals were design. Getting the community involved in the design process has been key to making sure that this project is equitable. Stay in place. Ensuring affordable housing, property tax deferment, home repair programs are also ways to make sure that this project is equitable. Business ownership, not only creating new businesses, but retaining existing businesses, especially those of people of color, are also critical goals of this project. And then lastly, equitable development. That is creating policy and procedures that promote equitable access and opportunities throughout the Greenway network. Lastly, they recommended that they hire equity and economic development director, this guy. In my job, it is for me to focus every day on policies, procedures, and creating partnerships that will allow GRG to meet these recommended goals. Next slide. So let's dig into the corridor area that GRG's equity efforts will have the greatest impact. The first is the North Connector, North Grand and Spring from Fairground Park to Grand Center. Next slide. In this project area, we're looking to establish a business corridor along the major arterials. What this will allow us to do is to stimulate job creation through small business and construction. We identified some of the key partners in this demographic area and also establish relationships with key donors. As stated before, this project received $15 million raise grant through the US DOT. Next slide. Through community engagement and community input, we were able to come up with a conceptual plan that reflected what the community would like to see in the area. They were wanting to see trees, landscaping. They wanted to see rest pits that people could enjoy, kiosks. And then one of the great things is the artwork. The community really wants to see artwork integrated into the Brick Line Greenway. Some of the sketches you see are the Buffalo Soldiers, who were African-American soldiers that came from the West to help fight during the Civil War. Next slide. The next corridor we'll look at is the Central Connector. The Central Connector is actually broken into 3 to 4 projects, but I want to focus on the Mill Creek project, which was talked about by our previous presenter, and then the MLS Stadium segment. Same approach in this segment. We identified the key partners and the key donors. One of the things that was critical to the partnerships and the resident engagement in this area was they wanted us to create a sense of belonging, just like the North Connector, but also they wanted us to revisit the past. As I stated from the East-West Gateway presentation, the Mill Creek Valley was predominantly African-American community that was destroyed by an urban revitalization project and the creation of Highway 6440. As you noted from the article that she had on her slide, it stated that it was a slum and crime-infested community, which is totally untrue. It was one of the most successful and prominent African-American business districts in St. Louis at the time. Next slide. Also looking to eliminate barriers that are created across major infrastructures. So one of the things that we're working with through the US DOT and also East West Gateway is getting funding to connect communities across these infrastructure projects. So there's grants like the Reconnecting Community grant through the US DOT, which came out as a part of the Biden ARPA funding, and then other funding mechanisms to create bridges and other ways to connect communities that were disconnected by revitalization projects. Next slide. And so this is reflective of what we have planned with the Mill Creek Valley plan. So I'll just show the next couple of slides, just conceptual drawings of what we have proposed for the brick line. And then also in front of the new MLS stadium, we are doing a plaza to commemorate the residents of the Mill Creek Valley. Next slide. And one of the things that during community engagement and civil engagement was that the residents wanted to make sure that there was places that commemorated their presence in the Mill Creek Valley prior to the Western Downtown Revitalization Project, but also have artwork incorporated in. So this artwork, which is known as the Mill Creek Valley Plaza, is artwork by a local artist, Damon Davis, which reflects the members of the Mill Creek Valley. And also there's landscape, which every seating area is the limits of the property owners previously, the properties that were previously there, the lots that were previously there, that were shown on the Sanborn map from the previous presentation. Next slide. And so that's obviously the new MLS stadium. Next slide. And so what I want to do is play a video to you that will do a way better job than me of explaining all the great work that we're doing at GRG related to the brick line. Yeah, you're turning it down. You might want to pause it, and I forgot how to. So I want to say at the top where you're sharing the screen, you might have to turn on the audio.
Apologize, everybody. Give me a second here. Share sound. Let's try again. So sound was not coming through at all?
No.
Okay.
In many ways, in St. Louis, one of the things that we have trouble doing is really bridging gaps and bridging divides between people and history and points of view. When you're on the Greenway, you might be shoulder to shoulder with folks that are not like you in how they appear or their age. It's also a melting pot, and that's a pretty terrific thing.
This project goes beyond just making beautiful space. I mean, it makes beautiful space, but it also makes opportunities for people to engage with each other. It makes opportunities for us to share differences, and it makes opportunities for us to address those differences in a positive way.
And not often do you get a chance to see things intentionally linked together for the advancement of the neighborhood or for the residents. And so I think this is an important piece because there's a desire to have people live beyond just their neighborhoods.
It connects the different projects within the city and connects those corridors that are already flourishing to corridors that need to be developed. You'll be able to see the different opportunities that exist along that Greenway based on the infrastructure that hasn't existed for some time.
There's a lot of momentum going on in the St. Louis region right now on many levels. The employers who are being attracted here, the level of cooperation, the level of focus. And among these successes, we're going to be able to count the Greenway. The Greenway is going to positively contribute to the quality of life of the people of the region.
If you look around to the most successful innovation zones in the United States, places like Austin, Texas, and San Diego, and San Francisco, and Seattle, those are places that have this vibrancy and connectedness, right? When you're trying to recruit a 24-year-old, they have a lot of choices. The things that they care about are the environment that they're going to work in, the ability to bike to work and to walk, and green spaces, and areas being connected. So it's super important, and I think one of the most important investments we can make.
The connection is exciting, but then kind of thinking about the journey there. You have the opportunity to take time while you're strolling to experience a new store or a mom and pop shop or an art stop or something like that. And the Greenway will help bring it all together. Overall, I think the Greenway is leveraging the excitement of living in the city of St. Louis.
In 1959, the first wrecking ball struck a blow to Mill Creek Valley to demolish the community that I'd known all of my life. It was my home. It was all I knew. There were lots of children, lots of things to do, friends to play with outside, in the street, in the backyard, in the alleys. Our schools were there, our churches. We did all of our shopping along Market Street. So it was a neighborhood.
There is a lot of historical context here on this ground, from Vashon to Harris Teachers College to now what we know as Harris-Stowe State University. We are really excited to be a part of this project because it's actually going to be able to highlight Mill Creek Valley and link us to all of the great things that are currently happening here in the city.
Our fans will have the opportunity to experience the Mill Creek Valley installation and this incredible artwork every time you come to the stadium. And this is a bold move. It's an intentional bold move because this is how we bring our community together.
Yeah, so I know that was a big data dump. I can't put into words how much energy and effort and thoughtfulness that we are at Great Rivers Greenway putting into making sure that diversity and equity and also economic development is thought about as we bring this amazing infrastructure project to an underserved portion of St. Louis. One of the things I want to circle back on that I forgot to do in my introduction is just look at the overall region of what Great Rivers Greenway operates in. This is our first go at doing a major infrastructure project in an urban setting. And so we want to make sure that we do it right. So with that, I will turn it back over to the leadership team and answer any questions that you guys have.
Great. Thank you, Chris. Saranya and Betsy as well. Thank you very much. Remind everyone that if you have any questions for the panelists, please feel free to submit them with the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. I know, let's see, we'll give a few time. So we still have time here. We're about at the hour mark, but we've gone a little over with Q&A before, so feel free to submit any questions that you might have. I know I might throw one out to start and give some people some additional time. Maybe with Saranya, I'll start. You mentioned one of the items identified in the process so far with your EIA was the issue of local match for grants for communities. I know I've it's not a surprise. I think it can be a huge burden, and probably for many. I'm curious if something we've discussed locally is if the conversation financially has come up as well about the reimbursement method, meaning that the communities not only have to have the local match, but they actually have to have 100% of the funds liquid, right? To do that, is that part of the conversation as well?
Yeah, we are, that's definitely part of the conversation, and we are looking at the funding process from the beginning all the way through the end, and any challenges that pop up. And the reality is, when you have a lot of these challenges, you can lose quality projects at any point in that line. And so absolutely, we're looking all the way across the board.
Great, thank you. All right, we have one that came in for Chris. The individual said, the video is such an incredible tool to build momentum. Has this been used to help get funding partners or to pursue grants?
Yes, it has. So this is one of 3 or 4 amazing videos that our promote team has put together. But this video in particular has been used by Edward Jones in their efforts to help us raise money. It's also been used by our GRG's foundation. So what we discovered early on also in the brick line project or process was that, and as you guys were just talking about, coming up with additional funding and ways to match any grants that might come our way. We established a foundation with some core leadership members and major institutions throughout St. Louis to help us raise money as a part of our private match for this. And so this video is used a lot by that organization to promote the brick line.
Thank you. All right, feel free to keep submitting. I'll throw another one out there maybe. And if the other panelists, if you guys have any questions for each other or Shilpi, please feel free to chime in. But Saranya, again, one of the graphics you showed was that 1990 to present investment of pedestrian projects, with and it seemed like it showed that the funding was pretty spread out. I know you mentioned a concentration within 270. Is that an accurate reading, or was it a surprise to East West Gateway, or?
So I think, geographically, it generally looks like it's accurate, it's spread out well, but this is only pedestrian projects. And on top of that, we really need to overlay this with needs of the community and a lot of the challenges that people face. So if you were to compare this with the earlier graph of current conditions, and where you saw where a lot of the bicycle and pedestrian collisions and fatalities happened, a lot of people could take that chart and say, no, that's not an equitable distribution, because a lot of the funds aren't being directed to where the need is, possibly for pedestrian facilities. And so there are many ways to kind of interpret that graph and the map, and many ways to think about how we distribute funds. It could be, geographically, or based off of highest population density, or it could be, getting those funds to the areas and regions that really need it. So there's a lot you can take away from that. I think overall, this was just kind of highlighting one of the maps that we produced in that TIP analysis.
Great, thank you. Looks like we have something from Scott. I'm gonna try to allow you to talk and see if you can get your question here. You should be able to unmute and ask your question if you have a question. Scott, we can't hear you if you're trying to ask.
I think he needs to unmute himself.
All right. All right, well, Scott, if you want to put something in the chat or the Q&A, or we'll try back with you in a little bit if you still have something. So
First of all, I would like to thank Ms. Betsy, Mr. Christopher, Ms. Saranya, and Ms. Katie for this informative presentation. And I hope the attendees learned about these exciting projects in the St. Louis region, and also how important is equitable transportation strategies for funding equitable investment and why it matters in our communities. Betsy, Betsy. I'm sorry for pronouncing it incorrectly, but I do have a question, not a question, but more like, can you provide more light on how we can information on the disadvantaged communities? Like you said, there are different USDOT and DOT has its own standards of defining like for the disadvantaged communities, what are the criterias and all. So can you just go through all those slides again so that whoever I think, Jonathan, you need to share that slide.
Okay, yeah, let me pull that back up. And Chris, we see that you have a meeting. So yeah, Chris, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Chris.
Appreciate it.
Well, no problem. Thank you guys for allowing me to participate. If you have any questions, my contact information is in the slide deck, and also feel free to share that video. It links to our YouTube station. So thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Chris. All right, let me share again here. Let's see.
And so for just the attendees so that they can have an idea for how they can information on disadvantaged communities.
For the different tools.
Yes, so some light on it. If Betsy can provide that, how we apply for that thing, that will be great.
Well, I think what you're going to find is a lot of the applications will be very specific as to what they're looking for. And it depends on, I mean, some of the examples that we've talked about today, or an example I think is a good one, which is until you knew with analysis where, there was a high number of minority deaths and serious injuries. Now you know that information, in say your urban area. I think that positions you to be able to identify what can you do in which categories can you apply for funding. So this would, I think, be an example where you can kind of pull some of that together as you put those applications together. So this is like the overview, and then the other and then there were also some other, there's US DOT as well as EPA with the EJ screen. And that looks at a lot of environmental aspects, and then social, with particulate matter, ozone, et cetera, and all the other types of waste. And then I think the next one was CDC, social vulnerability. So I think, when you put that together, as you make a compelling application, I think all these are going to help, to have a successful outcome. I have had an opportunity to sit on some review teams around the country, for raise and build program applications. And I think as a reviewer, kind of a frustrating thing is when you don't get that information, is when it's kind of missing, and you kind of have a feeling, well, they probably could have done a little bit more documentation. And so I'd say these are just tools. I think mainly you could use them for screening analysis locally. You could use them as you're in your application process. I think that's really where they're going to be very impactful. Now, if there's other ones, I don't have them up here that I'm not specifically aware of, but that can be another thing we can, try to take a look at to try to pull more resources like that together. But rather than, having to take, months or years to assemble all this information, hopefully a lot of this is going to be available to you, in a pretty fast way that you can use it and not have to rebuild it. So I think that's the best thing, in the short term that I'm seeing. I did want to address a question that had come back earlier about funding and having, reimbursement-based programs. And that is how most federal funding, for USDOT occurs. However, if you're in the Illinois, and I'll speak for Illinois because that's what I'm familiar with, but if it's a local agency that applies for funding and for, say, a project, and they have the Illinois DOT letting process that they follow, because you have to follow federal, rules when you when you get federal funding. So what they will do is they'll essentially front the money, and then there's a reimbursement after that. So it's not all it's not as bad as it might seem, but it's still a heavy lift for any local, no doubt. And on a lot of the programs, you got to read very closely for the applications. Some of them do not have a match requirement. Some are 20%, some are 10%. It's just kind of all over the place. And, some of it is just becoming very knowledgeable about those ins and outs of the program. So, I just wanted to add that from that earlier piece. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right, we did get one more question here, and I apologize. I guess the chat feature is disabled, so I apologize for that. I think it must be just for the panelists that we see it now. So sorry for that mistake. But Mara asked, and I don't know whether this is better for Saranya or if Betsy, if you want to weigh into, that's great. But her question is, have walkable, bikeable plans done by individual communities through TrailNet been considered in looking at the connections around the region?
I guess I'll jump in. Maybe this was a better question for Chris. But so I think when we're looking at the East-West Gateway level, we work to define regional policies and guiding principles for how we allocate money. And so we do look at the various advocacy, nonprofits, various local plans, regional plans, and we try to combine all of that input into our long range plans to essentially develop our policies on how we're going to allocate money. But since we don't necessarily play a role in sponsoring projects, we will evaluate projects. We're not necessarily directly looking at the specific connections around the regions that have been highlighted. But through the application process, once we get applications for some of the local funding programs that are available, we'll always review those project applications, and we will suggest improvements to better align with regional policies. And that might include something like increasing connectivity in our pedestrian or bike networks. And so those are something we will push project sponsors to try to improve their plans so that it aligns better with regional policy.
And another thing, kind of piggybacking on what she said, is, what I find too is the more, agreement you have among your constituencies. And I mean, if you have nonprofits, if you have, organizations that you're working with, to make sure you include them in the, in your application process, that, that they are your that they're advocating as well for these projects. So, and I think that goes a long way. I think we're going to see more and more of that kind of public-private and public-private partnerships as well as we move forward, much more than we've seen in the past.
I know I'm not a panelist, but I'll also add, and I know St. Louis County is not the whole region, obviously, but I know they went through a bike walk plan the past couple of years, and they, in their process, they looked at individual plans and trying to bring those into the fold for communities that are throughout St. Louis County as well. But obviously it's a much broader than just their scope as well. But that's a great point and great question. Thank you. All right. Well, we're almost 12:45. I don't see any other questions right now. So do you want to, panelists, anything, any last comments? Okay.
I don't have any comments, but for the attendees who attended today's presentation, you qualify for one equity credit. And also, as Saranya mentioned, for the East West Gateway, they are having one new Connected 2050 that you shared with us. Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that information. We look forward to that report. And as Rana mentioned, the virtual is taking place in October 2022, and draft will be coming in March 2023. So we look forward to that report. And I know it will be exciting and informative for everyone. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you again to the panelists, and thank you everybody for attending. Have a good day.
Everyone.
Thanks.